Well, hello everybody. This is a video presentation for CIS116 by Professor Tim Coates. This is a video on the Chapter 9 assignment. And I just wanted to go through a couple things with you all with Chapter 9 assignment, for those of you who are struggling with it. The first thing I want to talk about is the general concept behind the assignment, and that is basically to create a player class. And from that class, you would create two player objects that would essentially do battle, attack one another, and continue to do that until one of the players runs out of health points. So, as you learn in the course, when you have a class, you have different settings or attributes of a class. They're also sometimes called properties. And then you have things that a class can do, which you call methods. And there is another thing that we have in a class called an event, which is something that can happen to an object, although we really haven't talked much about that and isn't really covered in this course. It's dealt with in the advanced programming courses further along down the line. But we have our hands full, just understanding the basic concepts, which is totally normal. It's a lot to grasp when you first learn it. But basically the idea here is that you want to create a player class. And so if I come in here and I want to create a new Ruby file, so I'm just going to do that a second. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this Ch9asg.rb. And just to get right into the good stuff here, I'm going to create a class called player. And the assignment tells us that we want our player to have a name, and we want it to have a certain number of health points. So we need variables for those two things. Now, the two variables, then, when you're creating variables inside of a class in Ruby, you put @ signs in front of them. So we have an @name and we have an @health. And I guess it's probably better to call it health points. So I'll just be a little more specific. So we have name and we have health points. Now, when a player object gets created, and the class, again, it's like a blueprint. So however this class is defined is how the objects will work. So if I say that a player has a name and it's a set number of health points, then all of my player objects will have those. When I go to create a player object and I want to initialize various things, in this case, certainly the player's name. Now, the health points, we want every brand new player to start out with 100 health points. So basically what I'm saying is this. If I'm going to come in and make a constructor, which is what we call the function that is called when an object gets created, initialize, this is the place where you can pass in things that you want to use to initialize your objects. So for example, their name. Now, I can say if I call it name, okay, then what I'm doing on line 3 is I'm taking the name that got passed in this variable here, and I'm setting @name, which is the variable inside of the object. I'm setting that equal to this temporary variable here. So what that basically means is this. Okay, let me just fix this a minute here. So if I'm down here and I want to make a player, okay, so P1 equals player.new, that I can come in here and put a parameter in, so player.new, and then the string Tim. Now what's going to happen is when line 10 executes, it's going to create a new player object. It's going to take this class up here and it's essentially going to stamp one of those out. If the class were a cookie cutter and your computer's memory were dough, then the new method here is the action of stamping the cutter into the dough and forming an object, a cookie, or in this case, a player. And when we create this thing, we are passing to it a string. That string, in this case Tim, is going to be given to this variable name. and that variable name is going to be given to @name. Now it's going to be stored in this variable here. Now if I create another function called getName, that function should return the name back. Now why do we make a function that does that? Why can't we just say put p1.name? Well, first of all, it's not name, it's actually called @name. But you'll notice that gives us an error. And the reason for that is that fields, or properties, attributes, whatever you're calling them, in Ruby are private by default. They're private. So nobody can see @name. Now, if I create a getName function and return the name back out, that's how I can expose that variable to the outside world. This is called an accessor. Now, if I wanted to let people change the name, I could make a setName function where a new name gets passed in, and inside of that function I can say @name equals new name. So this is my accessor, and we call this a mutator. And that would enable me to say p1.set_name to Joe, and p1, if I say put p1.getName, even though when I created this object I called the name Tim, line 20 is going to change it to Joe. So when line 21 gets called, it should print out Joe. And if you see I run the program, that's exactly what it does. Now, this accessor and this mutator, or getter and setter, there's no validation here. What I mean by that is when you set the name, it doesn't check to make sure the name isn't a certain word or something like that. Let's take a look at health points as an example of what you could do when you go to set a field, like with set. So let's say I went in here and I created a getter and a setter for get health points. Simple, I just return the health points. And if I want to set the health points, I can pass in points. And normally I would just say, okay, health points equals points. So if the user could come down then with this set health points here, they could come down to their player and they could say p1.set health points, and they could set it to 100. They could set it to 50, but here's the problem. They could set it to anything. They could set it to a negative number. They can go outside of the range. We said that the health points must be a number between 0 and 100. So what the set method, or the mutator, can do is it can validate your input. So I could say, for example here, if points is greater than 0, let's say greater than or equal to 0, and points is less than or equal to 100, then set it. So now what will happen is it will, if I try to set the points down here to negative 500 million, whatever it is, right? It calls this function and it points here will be equal to that negative 500, blah, blah, blah. This if statement will say, hey, points has to be greater than or equal to 0, and it has to be less than or equal to 100. Well, it would be less than or equal to 100, but it certainly wouldn't be greater than or equal to 0, because that's this whopping big negative number. So it would not do this line 13 if the condition on line 12 was not satisfied. So you can use setters to validate your input to make sure that only the certain range of data that you want gets enforced. Now, if you don't need to do validation like this, and certainly for the name, I wouldn't really need to worry about it, then you can use a little shortcut. what you can do is you can come up to the top of your class and you can type up here attr_accessor, and with a colon you could put in name like this. When you do that, you can now get rid of getName and setName because you don't need them anymore. And the reason is because this one line of code on line 2 essentially gives you that capability for free. It's wrapped up inside of this one call here. So I can do that with the name, but I don't want to do that with the health points because I want to validate those. And so I'll do it for name, but I won't do it for health points. Okay, so now in the constructor, we pass in our name. Well, what about health points? What we're going to do is set that to 100. So what we're saying is when you create a brand new player, he's going to have a name that you're going to provide, but his health points are going to automatically get set to 100. If you can ask what the health points are, and it will tell you, you can try to set the health points, and it will take them as long as you're within range. So that's how that can work. Now, one of the things that we want to do is make a little change here. And what we want to do is, if they attempt to set the health points to a negative number, we want to set it to 0. And if they try to set the health points over than 100, we want to set it to 100. So what we'll say is we'll change this to do this. If points is less than 0, then we will make points equal to 0. Else, if points is greater than 100, then we set points equal to 100. Else, we go ahead and set it to whatever they wanted us to set it to. Okay, the one mistake that I made was I had an else space if here, and in Ruby it doesn't like that. It wants an ELSIF. That's one of the little weird quirks about Ruby. I'm used to doing it the other way because that's how I started in Java and other languages. Anyway, okay, I don't technically need these parentheses either, so I could write it like this. If points is less than 0, set it to 0. Else, if points is greater than 100, set it to 100. If neither of these are true, then it will set whatever you give it and put it in. So that's looking good now. So now coming back down here, I can create my player. It'll be Tim. It'll automatically have the 100 health points. If I try to call set health points to this negative number, and then I try to put out get health points, I get 100. Now shouldn't it have set it to 0? Yes, it should have. So what mistake did I make? Well, when I was up here, I should have said at health points equals 0 here, and at health points equals 100 here. So you have to watch for that. Make sure that you name things the right way. You won't always get errors in Ruby when you do this. You have to be careful how you set this up and how you define your variables. Now, of course, it may seem to you that these were mistakes that I've made. And actually, it should be obvious by now that I never make any mistakes. If it looks like it's a mistake, I actually did it on purpose, just to teach you guys some important concept about programming. So, right. Moving right along. Let's see. Okay, we've got accessor, the name, we've got our initialization, we've got get and set health points, and let's see here. Okay, yeah, one other thing I wanted to get into, and that was the attack method. The attack method is, it should be like this, where you pass in your opponent into the method, I can spell here, as an argument. And the idea is that you have a player object, and then you have a second player object, and you take your first player object, and you have that first player attack the second player. So it would look like this. If I set up, let me just fix this up a minute. So I'll make a second player here, and then we'll have p1.attack p2, and then p2.attack P1. And as you can see in both cases, player 1 attacks the other player, player 2 attacks the other player. So you're passing your opponent in, meaning P1 passes his opponent in as an argument, and P2 passes his opponent in. So going back to the method, the opponent is being passed in. So what you want to do ultimately is generate a random number. I'll just set damage equal to, I don't know, let's see, it has to be greater than 15. I'll just make a number just for now. I'll just say it's 18. And then you'd have to say opponent dot set health. Now, I'm going to make sure. Set health points. And the thing is, you want to reduce it by 18 in this case. So what you actually want to do, you want to set it to whatever it currently is. So I can call get health points. And then subtract the damage like that. So basically, you are going to your opponent and you're getting the number of health points they currently have. You're subtracting the damage. And then whatever that number is, you're setting it. So that's one way of doing it. It's by getting your, this is not going to have to stay like this. This 18, this should be randomly generated. And then if it's greater than 15, you want to not proceed. But if it's less than or equal to 15, then you would proceed here to do whatever on line 25, which is to get the health points, subtract out the damage, and then set the health points to that new value. And so if you wanted to, you could also make a method in this player class called reduce health points. And then you could just pass the damage into the method and it could do the subtraction for you. But it doesn't matter, either way is fine as long as it gets the job done. And then basically, once you've done that, you've got your player class finished, and you just have to have a loop down here that continues to loop while P1.get health points is greater than 0 and P2.health points is greater than 0. In other words, both players, well, actually, that's not true. Keep going as long as one of them is alive. If P1 is alive or P2 is alive, I was right the first time. They both need to be alive to keep going. So as long as P1 and P2 are both alive, then this attacking loop continues to go, and basically this code can go inside. The only thing is here is you don't, say P1 attacks P2 and kills player 2. Well, then you wouldn't want player 2 to attack player 1. So you want to put in here another check. So if P2 is, let's say, get health points, as long as the health points are greater than 0, then you can tell P2 to attack P1. Otherwise, you wouldn't want to do it because P2 would be dead. So P1 attacks P2. If P2 is still alive, then P2 attacks P1. Then this end while kicks in. As long as both players are still alive, it comes back up and continues. And the only other thing you'd want to do in here is have just indicate the situation to the user. So you can add up in your player class a display method that shows the name of the player and how many health points they have. And then you can call for each object that display method inside of your loop. And then at the outside of the loop down here, you would just check to see who was dead, and then you would just describe who the winner is, which is the one who's alive. So that's basically the setup in a nutshell. It's a concept that takes a while to get comfortable with, and it's going to take a lot of practice and just time, basically, until it starts to become more natural to you, and that's normal. This stuff is totally new, and you're still trying to grasp the basic concepts of programming, and object-oriented programming is a whole other level of complexity. So don't feel bad if you feel a little bit overwhelmed. It starts to get better over time. And hopefully this made sense to you, and we'll help you with the Chapter 9 assignment. And if not, if you have any other questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll talk to you in another video. Thanks for watching.